Somewhere in the dark over South Vietnam, a sound rolls across the jungle that the American infantryman learns to love more than almost any other. It is the distant thud of howitzers, the guns on a firebase kilometers away sending their shells arcing overhead toward an enemy he cannot see. By 1967, that sound is everywhere because the United States has chosen to fight this war above all with its artillery, and the men working those guns will fire more shells in Vietnam than America expended in all of the Second World War. They are called Redlegs. When an American unit is pinned down, surrounded, or fighting for its life, they are the men who answer, and no soldier in the field is ever truly alone as long as the guns can reach him. The name itself is older than Vietnam by more than a century. In the United States Army of the 19th century, branches of service were distinguished by colored trim on their uniforms, and the field artillery was assigned scarlet. Artillerymen wore stripes of red down the legs of their trousers, and the nickname Redlegs attached itself to them and never let go. By the time the howitzers reached Vietnam, the red stripe was long gone from the working uniform, but the name endured, passed down through generations of gunners as a badge of identity. The men serving the guns on a firebase in the Central Highlands in 1967 carried a title that linked them to the cannoneers of the Civil War and the Indian Wars. What had not changed across all that time was the essential role. The artillery existed to deliver concentrated indirect fire onto targets the gunners themselves could not see, guided to those targets by other men, and in Vietnam this role would prove central to the entire American method of fighting. In Vietnam, that role becomes the foundation of how the Americans fight. The war offers no front line and no obliging enemy who will stand and trade blows, so the United States leans on the one advantage it holds without question, the ability to deliver fire heavier than anything the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese can answer. The infantry's task, in large part, is to find the enemy and fix him in place. The killing belongs disproportionately to the guns. This makes the field artillery not a supporting afterthought but a central pillar of the war, and the whole arrangement depends on a single demanding condition. The guns have to be able to reach almost anywhere American troops might go. Reaching everywhere is the central problem, because Vietnam has no front line. The enemy can appear in any province, ambush a patrol on any trail, strike a base in any region and melt back into the population or across a border. There is no continuous line behind which artillery can be massed in the traditional way. The American answer is the fire support base, the firebase, a concept that comes to define the artillery war. Rather than concentrate the guns in a few large positions, the army scatters them across the countryside in a web of small fortified outposts, each holding a battery of howitzers, so that an infantry unit operating almost anywhere within range can call for fire and receive it within minutes. The fire bases are positioned so their fields of fire overlap, blanketing the surrounding terrain in what planners call a fan of supporting fires. An infantry company sweeping a valley is rarely outside the reach of at least one battery, and often several. Building these bases is itself an enormous undertaking, repeated thousands of times across the war. A firebase typically begins when helicopters or engineers clear a patch of jungle or a hilltop, often a position chosen for its commanding terrain and its ability to range the surrounding area. The guns are flown and slung beneath helicopters, along with ammunition, sandbags, barbed wire, and the men who will serve them. Within hours, a functioning artillery position takes shape, ringed by defensive bunkers and wire, with the howitzers laid in their pits at the center. Some firebases are temporary, occupied for a single operation and then abandoned. Others become semi-permanent fixtures, manned for months or years. The pattern of war in Vietnam means the Redlegs spend much of their time not maneuvering, but holding these fixed positions, firing in support of operations that may be taking place many kilometers away, against an enemy they will never see. The principal weapon of the Vietnam Redleg is the 105mm howitzer, and above all, the M101A1, the gun the crews simply call the 105. It is the workhorse of the field artillery, light enough to be slung beneath a helicopter and flown onto a hilltop, capable of a high rate of fire and able to throw a high explosive shell to a range of around 11 kilometers. It is found on nearly every firebase that rings the infantry's operating areas, and it fires the overwhelming bulk of the war's countless missions. When an American soldier in the field hears friendly artillery answering his call, more often than not it is the 105 that answers. The heavier guns exist for the missions the 105 cannot reach, and the artillery's character is best understood by working up through them, from this light, ubiquitous workhorse to the long-range pieces that duel with the enemy's own batteries. The work of actually placing a shell on a target is more complex than the simple image of a gun firing suggests, and it is here that the artillery system reveals its real character. The Redleg serving the howitzer does not see what he is shooting at. He receives firing data, an elevation and a deflection and a charge, sets the gun accordingly, and sends the round downrange on faith that the calculations are correct. Those calculations originate with a forward observer, an artilleryman attached to the infantry who can actually see the target, or with the infantry's own radio operator calling in a contact. The observer reports the target's location, and the request travels to the Fire Direction Center, the brain of the artillery, where men work the mathematics that translate a point on a map into the precise settings each gun must use. The Fire Direction Center accounts for the distance to the target, the difference in elevation, the type of shell and fuse, even the temperature of the powder, and the rotation of the earth on the longest shots. It is a system of distributed labor in which the man who sees the target, the men who do the mathematics, and the men who serve the gun are often separated by kilometers, linked only by radio. When it works, a few words from a frightened infantryman pinned down in a tree line become, within minutes, a curtain of high explosive falling exactly where it is needed. The pace of this work can be staggering. During a firefight, a gun crew might fire scores of rounds in a matter of minutes, the cannoneers moving in a practiced sequence, one man swabbing the bore, another loading the shell, another setting the fuse, the gunner laying the piece, the chief of section directing the hole. The labor is brutally physical. A 105mm round weighs around 15 kilograms, and the heavier shells weigh far more. Step up one caliber to the 155mm howitzer, the M114, and the weight of the work climbs with the weight of the shell. The M114 is the Redlegs' heavy fire support piece, throwing a round of more than 40 kilograms to greater range than the 105, and with a destructive effect to match, a gun proven accurate at extended ranges and built, in every sense, to deliver. Where the 105 is prized for being everywhere at once, the 155 is prized for what a single round can do when it lands. Its crews handle those shells by hand, hour after hour, in the heat and humidity of Vietnam. The guns grow so hot they can cook off a round prematurely. The noise is punishing, and many Redlegs leave the war with permanent hearing damage as a matter of course. In sustained fire missions, the crews work to exhaustion, soaked in sweat, deafened, choking on propellant smoke, feeding the gun shell after shell because somewhere out in the dark, men are depending on the rounds arriving. The organization of a gun crew reflects the precision the work demands, and every man has a defined role within it. A typical 105mm section is built around its howitzer and the handful of men who serve it, directed by a chief of section, a sergeant responsible for the gun, its crew, and the accuracy of every round it fires. The gunner lays the piece, setting the deflection and elevation passed from the fire direction center using the gun's sights. The assistant gunner works the breech. Ammunition handlers prepare the rounds, cutting the powder charge to the correct increment and setting the fuse, whether for an air burst above the target, a point detonation on impact, or a delay to penetrate before exploding. The choreography of a firing battery, several guns working in concert, is a thing of trained discipline, each section repeating its sequence in near silence under the chief's commands, the rounds going out in a steady rhythm that can be sustained for hours. The Redlegs' competence is measured in this rhythm, in the speed and accuracy with which raw firing data becomes steel falling on a distant enemy. Life on a firebase between fire missions is its own kind of ordeal, monotonous and miserable in ways the combat narratives often omit. The bases are dusty in the dry season and seas of mud in the monsoon, the men living in sandbagged bunkers and gun pits, perpetually filthy, plagued by insects and rats and the diseases of the tropics. There is the constant labor of maintaining the position, filling sandbags, stringing wire, cleaning the guns, stacking ammunition, digging deeper as enemy mortar fire teaches the value of overhead cover. There is guard duty on the perimeter at night, the strain of listening to the dark for the sounds of an approaching enemy. And there is the abrupt transition from boredom to violence, the call for a fire mission that snaps the exhausted crews to their guns at any hour, the firing, and then the return to waiting. The Redlegs War is largely a war of fixed positions and grinding routine, punctuated by intervals of intense and dangerous work, lived out on a patch of cleared jungle that is at once a fortress and a target. This dependence is the heart of the matter, and it explains why the artillery occupies such a central place in the experience of the Vietnam War. For the American infantryman, the artillery is salvation. When a patrol walks into an ambush, when a company is surrounded, when a fire base itself is assaulted in the night, the guns are what tip the balance. An infantry officer who has lost the initiative in a firefight can regain it by bringing down artillery on the enemy's position, and the speed with which the Redlegs can deliver that fire often determines who lives and who dies. The relationship between the infantry and the artillery is thus one of profound mutual reliance. The infantry protects the fire bases and makes the contact that gives the artillery its targets. The artillery, in return, promises that no American unit will ever fight entirely alone, that help is always a radio call away. This promise is the psychological foundation of American ground operations in Vietnam, and the Redlegs are the men who keep it. One particular technique comes to embody this relationship, and it reveals how completely the war revolved around the guns. American units adopt the practice of harassment and interdiction fire, often shortened to H and I, in which artillery fires throughout the night onto map coordinates where the enemy is suspected to move, trails and crossings and assembly areas, without any observer confirming a target is present. The theory is that this unpredictable fire denies the enemy freedom of movement and keeps him off balance, and on a typical night the fire bases of Vietnam pour thousands of rounds into the darkness on this basis. There is also defensive fire planned around each firebase and infantry position, pre-registered concentrations the gunners can fire instantly if the perimeter is attacked. The forward observer with an infantry unit will often register defensive targets around the unit's night position before dark, so that if the enemy comes, the fire can be brought down within seconds, sometimes directly onto the unit's own perimeter in extremity. The artillery is woven into every aspect of how the infantry lives and fights, present even when no battle is taking place, a constant rumble on the horizon that the troops come to find reassuring. The effectiveness of this system in actual combat is demonstrated repeatedly, and one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations comes in November 1965 in the Ia Drang Valley. There, in the first major battle between American regulars and North Vietnamese regulars, a battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division is air assaulted into landing zone X-ray, deep in enemy-controlled territory, and is almost immediately engaged by a far larger North Vietnamese force. The Americans hold across several days of intense fighting, and a central reason they hold is artillery. 2 batteries of 105mm howitzers, positioned on a separate firebase several kilometers away, fire thousands of rounds in support of the battalion, the guns growing hot and the crews working without rest. At moments when North Vietnamese assaults threaten to overrun the perimeter, the artillery is brought down danger close, just outside the American lines, breaking up the attacks. The battle confirms, in American eyes, the soundness of the firepower strategy. Wherever the enemy can be fixed in place, the artillery and air support can destroy him. The Redlegs at Ia Drang prove that the guns can be the decisive factor in a battle the infantry might otherwise lose. Yet the firebase that makes this reach possible also creates a vulnerability, and the enemy is quick to recognize it. A firebase is a fixed position in hostile territory, often isolated, dependent on helicopters for resupply, and surrounded by terrain the enemy knows intimately. To the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, a firebase is a target of opportunity and at times a deliberate objective. Overrunning one promises a propaganda victory, a haul of weapons and ammunition, and the destruction of the guns that have been tormenting them. As a result, the Redlegs find themselves in a paradoxical position. They are artillerymen, trained to fight at a distance, to never see the enemy, yet they are stationed in exposed outposts that the enemy actively seeks to assault at close quarters. When a firebase is attacked, the gunners must become infantry, defending their own perimeter with rifles even as they try to keep the howitzers firing. This is the other face of the Redleg War, the nights when the distant, mathematical business of indirect fire collapses into a desperate close-range fight for survival. The technique developed to meet this threat is among the most dramatic in the artillery's repertoire, and it speaks to the brutal intimacy these battles could acquire. When enemy infantry close on a firebase in such numbers that they threaten to breach the wire, the howitzers can be depressed to fire directly at the attackers over open sights, the gun aimed like an enormous rifle. The round used is the beehive, a shell packed with thousands of small steel darts called flechettes, which the gun sprays into the assaulting infantry in a lethal cone. A 105-firing beehive over open sights at attackers a few dozen meters away is a weapon of last resort. And its use means the battle has reached the perimeter. Firebases across Vietnam are saved by exactly this measure, the gunners leveling their pieces and firing flechette rounds into waves of enemy soldiers in the final moments before they reach the guns. The Redleg, in these moments, is no longer a distant artisan of indirect fire. He is fighting hand-to-hand with his howitzer. The artillery's prominence only grows as the war's characteristic patterns settle in. American operations frequently take the form of search and destroy missions, in which infantry sweep areas hoping to make contact with an enemy who chooses when and whether to fight. In this kind of war, contact is often sudden, sharp, and brief, an ambush sprung at close range before the enemy breaks away. The decisive factor in such engagements is how quickly the Americans can bring their firepower to bear, and that means how quickly the artillery can respond. A forward observer who can rapidly and accurately call for fire is worth more to an infantry company than additional riflemen, because he unlocks the destructive power of the batteries arrayed across the surrounding firebases. The entire tempo of American ground combat in Vietnam is shaped by the response time of the guns, and the Redlegs organize their entire existence around minimizing that response time. The crews sleeping beside their pieces, the fire direction center manned around the clock, ready to put steel on a target the instant the call comes. The forward observer deserves particular attention, because he is the figure on whom the whole system turns and the one who bears its risks most directly. He is an artilleryman, but he does not serve a gun. Instead, he walks with the infantry, sharing their patrols and their dangers, carrying a radio and a map, and the trained eye that can translate the chaos of a firefight into a grid coordinate and a correction. When contact comes, it is the observer who calls the first mission, who watches where the rounds fall and adjusts them onto the target, who decides whether to fire for effect with every gun in the battery. A skilled observer can bring fire onto a target with remarkable speed and walk it precisely where it is needed. And infantry commanders come to value a good one above almost anyone else attached to their unit. But the observer's position with the lead elements of the infantry and the radio antenna that marks him make him a priority target for an enemy who understands exactly what he represents. To kill the forward observer is to sever the infantry's connection to the guns, and the enemy hunts him as deliberately as he hunts the officers and radio men. The observer thus embodies the artillery's reach and its vulnerability at once, the man who makes the firepower possible, standing in the most exposed position on the battlefield. The scale of fire this produces is difficult to comprehend, and the numbers are among the most striking facts of the entire war. American artillery in Vietnam fires an estimated tens of millions of rounds over the course of the conflict. In a single year at the height of the war, the expenditure runs into the millions of shells. This represents an astonishing material commitment, a river of ammunition flowing from American factories across the Pacific to the fire bases of Vietnam, and it reflects the central premise of the firepower strategy, the belief that enough shells, delivered often enough, will grind the enemy down. The harassment and interdiction fire alone consumes a vast portion of this total, fired into the dark at suspected targets that may or may not exist. The logistics of supplying this much ammunition are themselves a major undertaking. with helicopters shuttling pallets of shells to firebases in a constant cycle, the crews unloading and stacking and then firing away what they have unloaded. But the sheer volume of fire raises a question that hangs over the entire artillery war. Is all this firepower actually achieving its purpose? The whole approach rests on the assumption that delivering enough fire will wear the enemy down past the point he can endure. Yet the enemy in Vietnam proves extraordinarily resilient, willing to absorb staggering losses and continue. Much of the artillery's fire, particularly the harassment and interdiction fire poured into the night, falls on empty jungle, expending enormous quantities of ammunition for uncertain return. The guns are devastatingly effective when they have a real target, when a forward observer can see the enemy and adjust the fire onto him. They are far less effective when fired on speculation at map coordinates, and a significant fraction of the war's artillery expenditure falls into the second category. The Redlegs work themselves to exhaustion firing missions, but the relationship between the rounds fired and the enemy actually killed is far weaker than the volume of fire would suggest. There is moreover a cost to this volume of fire that the impressive expenditure figures obscure entirely, and it falls on the people the United States is ostensibly there to protect. Artillery is a blunt instrument. A 105 or 155 round landing in a village kills whoever is present, combatant or not. The harassment and interdiction fire that pours into the countryside each night falls on terrain where civilians live and work, and the free fire zones declared across parts of South Vietnam, areas where anything moving is treated as hostile, become killing grounds in which the artillery operates without the restraint that the presence of an observer might impose. The South Vietnamese peasant, caught between the Viet Cong and the firepower of the Americans, experiences the artillery not as protection but as a constant arbitrary danger. Lali Hayslip, a villager from central Vietnam who lived through the war, captured the impassable position of the rural population caught between the two sides, fearing both the insurgents and the forces arrayed against them. The artillery, for all its effectiveness in battle, contributes directly to the alienation of the very population whose loyalty the war is supposedly contesting, a cost that no measure of rounds fired or enemy claimed will ever capture. The vulnerability of the firebases, meanwhile, is repeatedly tested, and the assaults on them produce some of the most desperate fighting of the war. Throughout the conflict, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces attack firebases across South Vietnam, probing the wire, raining mortars and rockets onto the gun positions, and at times launching full-ground assaults intended to overrun the base. The defenders, the Redlegs and the infantry stationed with them, fight to hold their perimeter while the howitzers fire in their own defense. Beehive rounds over open sites, defensive concentrations brought down danger close around the base by neighboring firebases. Some of these attacks succeed in penetrating the perimeter, and the fighting becomes a confused close-quarters battle among the gun pits and bunkers. The image of the Redleg as a man who fights at a safe distance dissolves entirely in these engagements. The firebase that projects firepower across the surrounding terrain is also a magnet for attack, and the men who serve the guns must be prepared at any moment to defend their position with their lives. These firebase battles throw the central paradox of the artillery war into sharp relief. When the enemy chooses to mass and assault a fixed American position, he hands the Redlegs exactly the target their entire system is built to destroy, and the result is almost invariably catastrophic for the attackers. Waves of infantry advancing on a firebase are met with high explosive and beehive at point-blank range, with defensive concentrations from neighboring batteries, and with air power summoned overhead, and they are slaughtered in numbers that dwarf the defenders' losses. In purely military terms, these are crushing American victories, demonstrations that no enemy can take a defended gun position and live. And yet the enemy keeps coming, accepting losses that any conventional calculation says he cannot sustain, because his purpose is not to win the firefight, but to bleed the Americans and the patience of the people back home who are paying for the war. The Redlegs win the battles decisively, and the war drifts away from the United States regardless, a contradiction that sits at the heart of the entire firepower enterprise. The siege of the Marine combat base at Khe Sanh in early 1968 offers the purest demonstration of what concentrated firepower can do, and it became one of the most famous episodes of the war. When North Vietnamese forces surround and besiege the isolated base, the American response is to unleash an unprecedented weight of fire in its defense, a coordinated effort of artillery and air power intended to break the siege through sheer destruction. The artillery at Khe Sanh and on supporting positions fires continuously, while overhead the bombers add their own staggering tonnage. The North Vietnamese forces around the base are subjected to one of the most intense concentrations of firepower in the history of warfare, and the siege is eventually lifted. Khe Sanh seems to vindicate the firepower doctrine in its most extreme form. Given a fixed enemy who can be located and targeted, American firepower can deliver annihilation. But the enemy in Vietnam usually does not present himself as a fixed target, and the lesson of Khe Sanh, that overwhelming firepower works against a concentrated foe, is one the enemy is careful not to let the Americans apply too often. The ground near the demilitarized zone presents the Redlegs with a different and more conventional challenge, and it is the one place in the war where they face an enemy who can shoot back at the same range. Here, North Vietnamese artillery positioned north of the zone, and in the hills along the border ranges American positions with its own guns, and the war takes on the character of an artillery duel of the kind the Redlegs trained for, but rarely encounter elsewhere in Vietnam. This is the work of the heavy guns, the self-propelled pieces too big to sling beneath a helicopter, hauled into position on tracked carriages, and it is where the last two members of the Redlegs family come into their own. The first is the M110, the 8-inch howitzer, and among the men who serve the guns it carries a particular reputation. It is the most accurate piece in the entire American infantry, a heavy, self-propelled howitzer capable of surgical fire at long range. Precision when precision is exactly what the mission demands. When a target has to be hit, and hit cleanly at distance, near a friendly position, against a specific enemy gun, on a bridge or a bunker that a less accurate piece might only straddle, the 8-inch is the gun the Redlegs want laying the round. Heavy fire delivered with the discipline of a marksman, that is the M110's signature. The second is the M107, the 175mm gun, and it answers a different need entirely: reach. Mounted on the same tracked, self-propelled carriage, the 175 throws its shell more than 30 kilometers, the longest reach on the American line, and it becomes the principal counter to North Vietnamese guns firing from across the border. Along the DMZ, the DMZ, the M107 is the counter-battery king, the gun that can strike enemy artillery firing from beyond the range of every lighter piece, outranging the guns that range the Americans. Counter-battery fire, the business of locating and destroying enemy artillery, demands its own specialized techniques: radar that tracks incoming shells back to their origin, observers who plot the flash and sound of enemy guns, and the rapid response that can land fire on an enemy battery before it displaces. Along the northern border, the Redlegs fight something closer to the artillery war of earlier conflicts, gun against gun, and the exposure of their fixed positions to accurate enemy counterfire makes this among the most dangerous artillery duty of the war. The heaviest guns also reveal how far the artillery's reach extends beyond the immediate support of troops in contact. The long-range pieces are used for interdiction, firing on supply routes, river crossings, and suspected staging areas deep in contested territory, attempting to disrupt the flow of men and material moving south. They strike at targets identified by aerial reconnaissance, by intelligence, by the patterns of enemy movement that analysts piece together. This is artillery employed not to save a particular infantry unit in a particular firefight, but to shape the larger battlefield, to make whole regions more costly for the enemy to use. Whether it succeeds is, like so much of the firepower war, difficult to measure. The shells land in remote areas where no one confirms the result, and the enemy's continued ability to move men and supplies south throughout the war suggests the interdiction fire, for all its weight, never came close to stopping him. The long-range guns fire enormous quantities of ammunition into the distance, and the war goes on. As the war continues into its later phases and American strategy shifts toward Vietnamization, the gradual handover of the fighting to the South Vietnamese armed forces, the artillery system and the fire-base doctrine are passed along with it. South Vietnamese artillery units take over many of the fire bases and inherit the same equipment, the same techniques, and the same fundamental relationship between the guns and the infantry they support. The results vary, as they did with the Americans, depending on the quality of the units involved and the circumstances they face. Where the South Vietnamese artillery is well led and well supplied, it performs much as the American artillery did. Where it is not, the absence of reliable fire support exposes the infantry to the same dangers that artillery had previously held at bay. The dependence on artillery that the American way of war instilled becomes, in the hands of the South Vietnamese, both an inheritance and a vulnerability, for an army built around the assumption of overwhelming fire support is in serious trouble when that support falters. To assess the Redlegs and their war is to confront the central paradox of American firepower in Vietnam. There is no question that the artillery was, in tactical terms, extraordinarily effective. Time and again it was the artillery that saved American units from destruction, that broke enemy assaults, that gave the infantry the confidence to operate in hostile territory knowing that fire support was always within reach. The men who served the guns did so with remarkable endurance and skill, working in brutal conditions, firing missions around the clock, and at times defending their fire bases in close combat when the war came to their own perimeter. In the battles where the enemy could be found and fixed, the Redlegs were as decisive as any element of the American military. The firepower strategy, at the level of the individual engagement, worked. And yet the war was lost, and the artillery's very effectiveness illuminates why. The firepower approach assumed that enough fire would break the enemy, and the artillery delivered it on a scale never before seen, millions upon millions of rounds. But the enemy was not broken, because the war was not, at its core, the kind of war that firepower was designed to win. It was a political and revolutionary struggle in which the loyalty of the population mattered more than any tally of the enemy dead, and in which the enemy could choose to avoid the set-piece battles where American firepower was decisive. The harassment and interdiction fire poured into the night. The free fire zones, the shells that fell on villages, did not break the enemy's will. If anything, the indiscriminate aspects of the firepower war alienated the population the United States needed to win over, undermining the larger purpose even as the guns won the individual battles. The artillery was a hammer of immense power, applied to a problem that was not, fundamentally, a nail. The Redlegs then owned the battlefield in a narrow but real sense. Wherever the guns could reach, and they could reach almost everywhere, no enemy could mass and fight in the open and survive. The American command achieved, through the Firebase system and the field artillery, a dominance of firepower across the South Vietnamese countryside that the enemy could never directly contest. But owning the battlefield, it turned out, was not the same as winning the war. The enemy declined to contest the ground the artillery dominated, fighting instead on terms that minimized American firepower, absorbing the losses and waiting out an enemy whose political will at home was eroding even as its guns fired without cease. The Redlegs won nearly every contest of firepower they were given. The war was decided elsewhere by factors the howitzers could not touch. There is a final irony in the story of the Vietnam Redlegs, and it lies in the disproportion between effort and outcome. The artillery worked harder, fired more, and endured more than perhaps any comparable force in the history of the American military, sustaining a tempo and a volume of fire without precedent. The men who served the guns gave everything the strategy asked of them, and the strategy still failed, not because the artillery fell short, but because it succeeded at a task that was never going to be sufficient. The howitzers on the fire bases of Vietnam delivered a crushing weight of fire onto an enemy who simply refused to be crushed by it. And in that gap, between the overwhelming firepower the Redlegs provided and the victory it could not produce, lies the essential lesson of the American war in Vietnam. The most powerful artillery in the world cannot win a war it does not understand. The Redlegs owned the battlefield. They did not in the end get to keep it.